Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining Keeping Forests and our guests today. We have three very special guests here to talk to us about building brands that build conservation movements. Before we dive in, I just want to talk a little bit about the technical details of this. You do have access to the chat, and so I encourage you to talk to one another in the chat and introduce yourself, tell people where you're from or at geographically, your organization. And then if you're having comments, I'm not going to be monitoring the chat per se, but we do have a question and answer box as well that you can toggle into, and I'll turn to that occasionally to see what questions are there. As we get going today, for those of you who don't know about Keeping Forests or are joining us for the first time, welcome. Keeping Forests is a market-driven forest conservation effort, and we're focused on conserving the 245 million acres of forests in the South, specifically interested in supporting those private landowners that manage 85% of that land, and are doing that as working forests. So thank you, welcome. Before we get started and introducing each of our guests, I think it's important that we understand what the context of all of this webinar is. Why are we talking about brands? And this conversation really focuses more on brands, storytelling, and conservation and messaging or marketing. What I have found throughout my 20+ years of working in conservation, not only that the stories really matter, but that there is a huge desire for people to understand our stories. And so often we're talking to one another using our own messages, and we really want people outside of our immediate audiences to care, but we don't necessarily bring in people from the outside whose jobs are branding and storytelling and marketing. And the group of guests that we have here today, this is their experience and background. Each of them has worked with Keeping Forests, and I'm so proud to say that, because they really have helped us to build what I think is a really powerful movement, a really powerful partnership, and a really powerful way of telling our story and helping our partners tell our story, their story rather. So welcome to you, welcome to our guests. Just briefly, and we're using an owl today to broadcast this, so it will zoom in and out as each of our guests are talking. And so hopefully it behaves in that way. We also just had a nice lawn service join us outside. So hopefully that doesn't stay too long, and hopefully that's not too distracting. I'm actually going to introduce each one of our guests one by one. And I'm going to introduce them in the order that they have worked with Keeping Forests. So the first guest that we have today is Blake Howard. Blake is the co-founder of Matchstick, which is a firm that is based in Atlanta. It's a brand identity house, which I'll have him say a little bit more about that. But for leaders taking bold steps toward creating radically relevant brands. And Blake and team have worked with clients like Chick-fil-A, UPS, Boys and Girls Club of America, Human Rights First, City of Atlanta. I know a few others, but I'll let Blake talk about that. Award-winning agency featured in Fast Company and many others. And so we're really glad to have Blake here today. His involvement in the Atlanta community and how I first came to know him was with it's a national chapter. It's a national organization that has chapters in each city called Creative Mornings, and it's a monthly lecture series for the creative community. So Blake, welcome.
Thank you.
We're glad to have you here. We first started working together, working with Matchstick in 2019.
Yeah.
And you and your team helped us to build the brand that is now Keeping Forests. And I think a lot of people, when they think about brand, think about the visual aspects of that. And I'm really proud of our logo and how we show up visually. It's powerful to me. It's really unique, and our partners helped to co-create that. So that was something that about 20 of our partners worked with your team in doing. Your team came out to a landowner site and talked to them. That was a really special opportunity. We're glad that you were able to be so involved with us. So I'd love for you just to say a little bit about Matchstick, your work, and what you do as we get started.
Yeah. So the project that we worked with you on with Keeping Forests, transitioning from keeping forests as forests to just keeping forests is sort of our bread and butter. We have organizations on the brand side of change. So when they're thinking about how do we define who we are, how do we go to market, how do we really build relevance with our audience, we need to think about things like name, visual identity, messaging, overall look and feel, things like that. So when we think about brand, you know, it's this sort of like reputation that's out in the market, but then we have tools that suggest that reputation, that point towards that reputation. So logo, name, look and feel, key messaging are all little signposts that point towards what that ideal reputation is. So we work with organizations to say, this is who we want to become. This is the ideal reputation. Now, what are the right tools that we need to point towards that?
Yeah, and one of the things that I feel like was a big task for you all is that Keeping Forest represents 40+ private, nonprofit, and public sector organizations. So you really had a big task in front of you of being able to say, how do we create a unifying, not just look, right, and signposts, but unified messaging that supports so many different organizations that have different missions and all sharing a desired outcome for keeping forests, southern forests, but coming at it from really different angles. So I feel like the verbal messaging was also something that was you've done really well for us. And how do you think about that with other kinds of organizations?
Yeah, a lot of times it is a process of input and hearing from all the different stakeholders and their perspective and seeing where the overlap is. And usually that overlap is a higher level idea. So sometimes I feel like, you know, organizations that have so many stakeholder groups like Keeping Forests does and did, the angles into the problem might be different, but the problem itself is the same. So finding that core problem that's usually higher level, you know, like it's basic, it's really simple, and then messaging from that place and not getting too hung up into the specifics usually works best. So we elevating that message to a simple idea that everyone can get on board with.
Yeah, awesome. You've done that really well. And so I'll move on to Brooke in just a second, but I want to ask you, you have a phrase that you use a lot. You have a book that you have written on the phrase radically relevant. So what does radically relevant mean?
Yeah, so I'll give you a quick story and then be really specific in the answer. But growing up, I used to fly with my dad. He had his pilot's license, and we would take trips together, which was so fun and such a blessing to be a young person flying different places. And he had a really small 4-seater plane, and it was awesome to go on trips most of the time. But sometimes we would have a headwind, and that headwind would be paralyzing. I mean, instead of a 2-hour trip, it would be a 6-hour flight. And you would look on the ground and it looked like school buses were going faster than you. You know, you're like, how are we even flying? We're going so slow. But then other times we'd have a tailwind and we would just get there quickly without turbulence and whatnot. And so I think about brand in a very similar way, that it's this invisible force that is either propelling your mission forward or slowing you down. And so a lot of our work is about helping organizations first just get clarity. Is it a headwind or is it tailwind? Your brand is an asset. Is it propelling your mission forward or is it slowing you down? And the way that we start to measure that and to look at that is basically through that radically relevant lens. So how radical is your organization from a brand perspective? Are you really distinct from the competitive landscape? Are you really clear? Are you really giving people the right tools and assets that they need? And then how relevant are you at the same time? Are you connecting with your audience? Do you understand who your audience is? Do you know what they need? Are you delivering on your promises? So radically relevant is about doing two things well. It's about being really distinct in the market, but then also being really valuable at the same time. And sometimes you see brands that do one or the other. You know, they're like off the charts wild and getting attention because they're so different, but maybe they aren't connected to the real value that the market wants. And then most of the time you see a lot of emphasis on value and relevance, but everyone's sort of blending in and they're not necessarily standing out. So we try to do both things, be radical and relevant.
Yeah. For those of you that are interested in the chat, I'd love for you to tell one another, do you feel like the organizations that you work for are radical or are they relevant? And so just have that conversation. Real quick, where can people find your book?
RadicallyRelevantBrand.com. And there is a free assessment you can take that will tell you exactly where your organization is.
Very cool. Thank you. All right, so now I'm going to move on to Brooke Tolley. Thanks, Brooke. Brooke is actually, she flew down to be with us today from New York, but just so you know, she has her roots in the South. She went to NC State, so everyone here is connected to the South. And Brooke joined us in 2021. So during the pandemic, we had done a public opinion, we'd done public opinion research, not with you, but with a firm that focuses on that. We did that during the pandemic, so it was fantastic because everybody was at home and stuck on message boards. So we got some really
And
good.
excited to answer some questions for research.
Right, exactly. We were talking earlier, we found out that toilet paper was definitely not relevant during the.
How is that
Shocking.
possible? I still don't get it yet.
So Brooke had the task of taking data, quantitative and qualitative data. And she came in and she was working with one of our strategies called Forest Champions and Leaders, which is really focused on how do we build advocacy from leaders adjacent to the forestry sector to help them tell the story of Southern working forests and private land ownership. And so we asked you to come in and say, okay, how do we translate all of this data into something that is usable, that can be tactical, but is also interesting?
Yeah.
Right. And so you boiled that down into 10 messages. You also, Keeping Forest, one of our principles is that we do things collaboratively with our partners, and we bring in these experts to help us. And so you came in and you worked with our team for about 6 months to create a messaging playbook. And so what I'd love for you to do is just talk a little bit more broadly about the work that you do in conservation messaging and marketing.
Yeah.
And we'll weave in a little bit about what that looked like with Keeping Forest. But thanks for joining us from New York.
Sure.
Welcome.
No, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. It's great to be in Atlanta, which I've spent very little time in Atlanta, so I'm happy to be here. So a lot of my work, I consider myself a behavior change strategist. Sometimes I call myself a behavior change communicator, mainly because I haven't necessarily defined my radically relevant term yet, which Blake, you'll help me with maybe after this. But a lot of that work is working with nonprofit organizations, government agencies, who are on the front lines of wildlife conservation, sustainability, climate action, certainly some growing topics. And they are interested in engaging their audiences a bit more effectively to really reach a point where more people are out there doing things that are planet-friendly actions, living planet-friendly lifestyles, and kind of making that shift. I've come in at various points in a project, but the point where Keeping Forest brought me in was a great place where data had been collected. I love it when a group is doing some research, and it's a typical kind of like, I think, junction point for a lot of organizations of like, we've got all this data, this is awesome, it's telling us a lot of things. What do we do with it? I mean, now what? And the transition from understanding your audience a little bit more through data to now, how do we actually like communicate with them and engage with them and make this relevant or get people excited about our work is actually a difficult gap. And I feel like a lot of organizations can kind of fall flat there and either ignore the data they have and just go in some other direction, or feel stuck and actually are in some ways paralyzed and aren't able to move forward and connect with their audiences. So I love kind of being in that space and saying like, this is how we can really use this information, these insights, to get people excited about a cause, to get people feeling ready and prepared to do something different in their lives. Maybe it's something small, like I'm going to ditch these single-use plastic straws. Maybe it's something bigger, like I'm going to, adopt a lifestyle of more plant-based eating or low-waste eating. Any of those sort of lifestyle changes is really where I've been focused on, and helping engage everyone in these movements that we're really trying to create, and helping these organizations start movements. So not just, flash in the pan moments, which typically been around donations, but how do we like mobilize all of our audiences to really take greater action and make bigger changes?
Yeah, and I didn't give the jump in with the intro bio that I did with Blake, but I think it's really important for people to know that you did not come from a conservation background.
That is right.
You actually came from marketing in an ad agency, you worked with Ogilvy, you were doing a lot to sell products.
Yes.
So you're coming in with a background that is both agency-based, right, as well as translating that to conservation specifically. And so what prompted that shift in your work, and what remains really important about what you learned
Yeah.
before?
Sure, and it'll be interesting if Blake and Puya have some similar experiences of, I loved working in advertising. I think that the creative magic that happens there, the audience research that happens, the strategy work that happens in advertising agencies is, phenomenal, like second to none. But I did start feeling like I'm just selling products that maybe people don't need and aren't necessarily adding value to the world. So, existential crisis kind of stuff I was having in my like mid to late 20s, definitely feeling it, saying I want to add value with the skills that I have and the things that I find really interesting. And at the time, I really thought I was making a career pivot when I decided to go into wildlife conservation. I thought it was a 180, I'm leaving advertising behind and I'm going into this. But when I was researching what someone like myself could do in wildlife conservation, I learned about an organization named RARE, where you and I both spent some time working at, and they were talking about a methodology of social marketing or behavior change campaigns, behavior change communications. And that got me really excited. And I've worked there for about a decade, kind of more bridging these worlds than thinking of it as a complete career shift. And it was surprising. And certainly it's like hindsight, kind of wisdom that I'm having. I didn't have it at the moment of being like, there's so much need for what's happening in advertising to be applied to conservation, sustainability, and climate action. And those worlds are starting to get closer, but they've been really far apart traditionally, or in conservation used primarily again for like the donation part of it and not necessarily for the larger engagement movement side of things.
Yeah. And you've worked all over the world. Your client list includes WWF, Wildlife Conservation Society, Keeping Forests, FAO, traffic. And so you have a broad experience looking internationally at how this applies as well as within specific organizations. You have a term that is mode of action, right? And you're actually going to be doing a live training with us a little bit later in the day. But what is mode of action? What is that term?
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a mashup of motivating and action. And I really try to stay focused on that because so much traditional messaging in, again, the conservation and sustainability space has been around awareness. We want people to know, or we want people to care more. And while all of that is wonderful and good, I want to kind of move us all and kind of lean a little bit more heavily towards what does it look like to actually motivate people to do things. And increasingly people want to do things. There's so much data out there about, audiences being concerned about the state of the planet, feeling antsy, like they want to contribute, but they don't know how, even feeling dismayed that a lot of times when they're told to do things, it's like recycling. They're like, oh, I don't know if recycling works anymore. But, and maybe it doesn't, right? These are all like real things. But we have to, I think, stop thinking about the collective audience as a group that doesn't know and doesn't care, and start thinking more, they're ready, willing, and able. So how do we actually motivate action with our work? And what does that look like?
Yeah.
So both getting to like clarity on what it looks like and the mobilization aspect of getting people on board.
Yeah, we'll talk a little bit more about this idea of like, if only people knew. We just need to make people aware and then they'll just do it, right?
I have a lot to say about that.
Yeah, we'll talk about that a little bit later. But thank you, welcome.
Yeah, thank you.
And the last is my friend Puya Diana. So Puya actually, yes, hello. He's the managing director of Beam Imagination. And if I actually told his entire biography of the things that he's working on, we might be here all day, but Beam is a creative studio. You rethink the methods of storytelling, and you have roots in the journalism industry, actually did a lot with sports journalism work. Your work was featured in AJC, New York Times, so you're coming from a deep background in media as well. Actually, one of my favorite things that you've done, of the many things that you've done, is the picture that you took of John Lewis. And look up Puya Diana and John Lewis, and there are some amazing, beautiful, beautiful photos. He works with, his client list includes Delta Airlines. You've worked with Atlanta Braves. You've done a lot of work across the community, and are really deeply engaged in Atlanta. Have created a co-working space, which is called Create ATL, which to define it as a co-working space does not do it justice. It really is an incubator and community activism space as well. And we started working with you last year, although Puya and I have been working together for many, many years. And so I know the skills that you're bringing to Keeping Forest, and you're really helping us to take Keeping Forest to the next level of communication. We've been working on our strategies. Now we have some sense of what they are, and I'm really excited about not just the website that's about to be launched, but this flywheel of communications that is going to tell the story of what Keeping Forest is and what it can do, and really supporting our partners and getting done with what they need to do. So tell us a little bit more about your work. Welcome. Tell us about the storytelling that you're helping us do and other organizations do.
It's really tough acts to follow, first of all. So my name is Puya, that's like Booyah with a P. We're nothing without our stories. Stories are the only memory that we can leave behind. And it's really easy in times like this when we all have social media for us to think that everyone cares about our story. And they don't. And we have to build community around stories. We have to encourage people to share their stories with one another. And much like yourself and the epiphany you had, I decided not to leave the world of marketing and advertising, but rather work with organizations who I can pull down to understanding sort of the new 4 Ps of marketing. 5 decades ago, that was product, price, promotion. Now it's purpose, positioning, partnerships, personalization. And at the heart of all of that is the story. And I try to say we're medium agnostic. I am a former photographer, but we've told stories through video. We've used 270 cameras to scan every player on the Atlanta National League Baseball Club. We've attached an 8K camera to the nose of a fighter jet. All of those were not to get across a widget or make a piece of content, but to help some of this country's most important brands connect with their audience in an emotional way, to feel something that maybe they didn't feel before. And Keeping Forests is letting us do exactly that again. And the richness of stories that are out there is really what inspires us to keep going and to ask brands, hey, are you talking to the people that are out there right now? Or are you inviting them to engage with you? And we have to find ways to meet folks where they're at and get them excited about the untold stories that are out there. I'll give this story. Last week, I was in the middle of the Okefenokee Swamp. And my son and I were on a motorboat. There's alligators swimming around because it was a nice cloudy day. Nice 13-foot alligator was sitting under a 950-year-old cypress in the middle of the place. And I took my 10-year-old son, and almost 10, and I said, listen, this tree has been here well before us, and it's going to be here well after us. And that's what a story is. It's how we can get things to connect for generations to come after that. And we have to look at our surroundings as a story too. And it clicked for him and he got it. And I try to use my kid and my mom as a litmus test for, did that connect with you? Yeah. We have to find stories that don't meet and connect with everyone, but with the folks that we're trying to talk to, that they make a change in them, they stick with them. And that's really my job. It's taken me a lot of places, including NC State, including catwalks for Sports Illustrated. But at the end of the day, that epiphany for me was, it's great to make photos, tell a good story through video, but how do we make impact? Yeah. And how do we get our biggest entities in society, companies, corporations, the government, to be excited about that rather than feel like they are being forced into it?
Yeah. So Keeping Forest knows that there are a lot of untold stories about the South, about working forests. What are untold stories? That's a term that you use a lot in your work. What is an untold story?
An untold story is still a story. It's out there. It's sort of like if a tree falls in a forest. People, untold stories are where folks like me come to the table and find that gem that already exists within an organization. Finds that Steve Taylor, who we talked to the other week at Auburn about his family farm, and make sure that people understand in our community what his story is and how it connects to the work that Keeping Forest does. So untold stories are people that and projects that already encapsulate everything that an organization might be about. And they've never been polished into a diamond that everyone can see for the brilliance that they have. So they're all around us everywhere, every brick, every stone, every 950-year-old cypress.
Yeah. And I think I'd love to jump to that term, everyone, and also thinking about the number of untold stories. I think that's something in the conservation community that we get really excited about and really wrapped up in, is like everyone needs to know everything about every piece of our story, which I think that often gets lost in the noise. And so really this is for anyone. I mean, I hear a lot, if everyone only knew. If everyone knew, then they would take action, going back to what you said, Brooke. But I also feel like when we say everyone, we have lost before we started. And so I'd love for you all to talk to me about, how do you think about audiences, audience engagement? You know, could it be an audience of one? Does it have to be an audience of the entire world? Talk to me a little bit about your process in helping your clients think about that, and specifically bringing that back to some of the people that are participating today. How do they think about identifying and engaging those audiences?
I can answer it from like a brand perspective, because I do feel like that sometimes can be a little bit higher level, and we get the everyone audience comment all the time. So for me, it's all about focus. What's the focus of the organization? And if you do think about brand as this intangible asset, who is that brand really for, and what do you want it to do? So sometimes in the for-profit world, you know, people need the brand to just like help be a tailwind for the outbound sales process, right? Like they want the name to be a quick get, they want the logo to be simple, they want the messaging to be sticky. So in that situation, like it just needs to be kind of a quick thing, and it's for a certain person. But I think in general, it's all about focus, and an audience is a part of that focus. So who is it that you're really for? Who is it that really matters? Who is it that you need to think through your brand resonating with a certain group? So sometimes there's beneficiaries of what you do as a nonprofit, as an organization. Sometimes there's partners that are helping you in that mission and in that work. Sometimes there's other stakeholders involved. So I think it's just a process of saying, all right, who matters most, which is hard because it feels like you're putting a hierarchy around individuals. But in a strategic conversation, you do have to have a hierarchy. Who matters most? And then what we often do on the brand side is we try to get a little bit past the demographics, and we look at the psychographics and the mindset of what's the mindset and what's the need that you're really solving for this group, you know, and that starts to build some focus and allows us a lot of times to then name that persona that's more about their needs and more about sort of what's happening in their world, and less about, you know, their age or their gender or their household income or any of the demographic information. And it's more about a mindset, which that mindset then is connected back to the focus, and it's connected back to the single problem that you're solving. So nonprofits in particular, if they say everyone, what's interesting about that is the problem that they're solving doesn't necessarily impact everyone. Maybe on a global sense it could, but the problem that you're solving is probably really focused, and the problem that you're most equipped to solve is also probably really, really focused and specific. And so sometimes it's just like a discipline, sometimes it's like this ambition that you want to say everyone, but you have to kind of drill down and get a little bit more focused. And the focus element, I think, is directly connected back to brand, which then leads to storytelling and messaging and all the other things.
And I think what we're finding with the audiences that we identified at the beginning, well, the primary one was the economically invested, and what, as we were really thinking about internally or economically invested in, then the other two kind of tease that out. But what we're finding is that because we're market driven, we're actually probably talking a lot about our audiences being corporate entities. So that's an interesting thing that's evolved over time. What about you two? What else can you think about with audiences and
Well,
engagement?
about 10 years ago, and I don't even know if it was that long ago or if it was longer ago, but Seth Godin, who's like this marketing guru guy, wrote a piece about finding your minimum viable audience, your MVA. And I sort of latched onto that pretty quickly as a helpful way for folks who take my training courses or my clients to have that focus and drill down. And he defines it as the smallest number of people you would need to engage to start having an impact. Right? Because we do have these like beautiful visions of everyone taking action, everyone adopting planet-friendly lifestyles. And I love that as a vision, and it's necessary as a vision. But in practical terms, it's really hard to do that. Rarely do we have the budget even to reach everyone. I mean, like Coca-Cola can do that, but we're not working with Coca-Cola budgets here. We're working with, much smaller budgets and staff capacity. And thinking about that sort of focus of, we're going to target these 5 policymakers, or we're going to target folks in these 3 towns or this state, and just think about where you can actually start having an impact. And then you can make those strategic decisions of like, I'm going to scale up from here. Because we're moving the needle. We see the change happening. We know that what we're doing is making an impact and working. Now we can scale up, but it is so hard, I think, especially in the conservation sustainability space, to feel like you're taking people off the table and not speaking to them. Because it feels so dire and so urgent. Like, how can we afford to not talk to everyone? But we'll have greater results and greater impact if we stay focused, make these strategic decisions, and, to take your term again, like, that helps you be relevant. And if you're relevant, people are more likely to, perk up and say, oh, you're speaking to me, or that sounds like me, and now I'm going to pay attention. And if you're spread to try to be relevant to everyone, like, I don't even know how one does that. So I do think it's so important to see results. And even though I know it feels like a huge trade-off that we can't afford, we will do better if we make those strategic decisions.
And it helps to be able to test things too, right?
Totally.
I mean, Keeping Forest covers a 13-state geography, so, but we need to test to see what can be scalable, and we're doing some of that work in piloting work that's very similar to your background in South Carolina. But I mean, there's a lot that can be invested, and you're right, people don't have these enormous budgets.
Right.
So being successful at a smaller scale creates momentum.
Yeah, it's a proof of product. I mean, I don't even think we use a lot of those terms a lot in conservation, but it's still very applicable. Is this going to work? Are we seeing a difference happen, even if it's baby steps? And then that, okay, we can maybe test this or replicate it or tailor it to another place that's going to have a similar formula to this. As opposed to kind of in advertising, we called it the spray and pray approach, where you just kind of putting your messages everywhere and hope somebody, hears it and does something. I think even big brands are starting to see the value, like big corporate brands seeing the value of regionalization, tailoring, community-based messages, and not just saying the same thing to everyone all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I may be the one person at this table that thinks this, but this is the only time in human history where it's okay to have the ambition to reach everyone. There's been no other time where we've been connected like this. Now, that being said, awful strategy. You have to know who you're talking to, define those audience buckets, drill down, make sure you have that persona of the folks that you're going to most easily reach. And where storytelling comes in, and I hate it because everyone's using the word storytelling for whatever. They're like, oh, that's storytelling.
Yeah.
It's not. What storytelling can do, if you have the right strategy and the right audience personas that you're targeting, is make folks that are already close to that table be passionate brand ambassadors at that table. And when you can accomplish that conversion, when someone goes from like, I like forests, to I'm gonna be part of the mission critical movement for southern forests, you don't need to tell everyone your story, because they will.
Yeah.
And so inspiring a generation and a network of brand ambassadors that dare to say, I don't care if you live in Maryland or in Canada or in Europe. This story is so great and so connected to our world that I'm gonna dare to tell you about it. And maybe the word everyone remains this untouchable ambition that we can have. Again, terrible strategy to talk to everyone, but can you inspire a lot of other people to help you get some of the way there? Maybe.
One quick example related to the everyone is, you think about Amazon, they're like quite literally, you can get everything, anyone can get it. I mean, it's like, talk about scale and being broad in terms of a brand.
Yeah.
But they started with online books. So they started with a very specific focus, and then they scale and they grew it. Or Google was all about search, and they've grown it and scaled it to everything and anything, you know? So I think from a brand perspective and from an audience perspective, getting really focused is just the beginning. And then you can scale towards whatever that ambition is, but you just can't start with, we're gonna reach everyone with spray and pray.
Yeah, that reminds me though, I mean, the idea of even Amazon starting very specifically, I think a lot about. And we're about to help us tell some really great stories visually, these sort of mini documentaries that will get people really excited. We hope that they'll get people really excited, but there's a difference between making like really exciting, splashy, really cool stories. And those stories actually translating into, or those brands actually translating into, or those messages actually translating into something that makes impact. And so, you know, I'd love to hear, I've called them sort of these marketing fails, right? Like where everyone knew the story, everyone knew the brand, but the impact that that brand was making or that message was meant to have didn't actually come through. Everyone knew what the message was, but it didn't then carry over into actual impact. So what are some of your favorites? You guys have seen a lot over your career. They don't have to be your clients or your market fails.
Our clients are all successful.
Of course.
Never happened.
They always listen.
I have one that's controversial.
Yeah.
But somewhat recent, like within the last year, so it might help, it might feel relevant. But Elon Musk acquiring Twitter, rebranding to X. So most experts were like, what is happening? Like the way he went about announcing the change and sort of haphazardly threw away, 20 years of equity and lots of value in terms of the brand, just gone, However, I think that if he would have actually changed features in the platform, significant features to deliver on the vision, remember the vision was like, it's gonna be X, it'll be this everything app, it's banking, it's this, it's that, and there are some parallels maybe like in the Asian market that he was trying to live up to that have sort of achieved that. If he would have said, it's no longer Twitter, it's X, and it's gonna do this, this, and this, and now you can access that product, it's out there, I think it would have been successful. I think we all would have gotten past the loss of Twitter and our emotional connection to the little bird or the history of that like, social media brand. But he didn't, nothing's changed, and now it's just X, and so everyone's like, wait a minute, why did you change it again? So I just feel like the delivery, he promised certain things, their leadership promised certain things, and then as consumers, we haven't really felt those promises be delivered, and so we're like, X is weird and worthless, and I don't understand it. And actually, I got an email the other day from an ex employee saying, hey, would you like to advertise on X, blah, blah, blah. And I responded, I was like, I think I'm good, but are you tired of having to say Twitter/X? And the person responded and said, every single day I have to say X, formerly Twitter. Because we all still call it Twitter, So anyway, that's a fun, like somewhat recent failed story from my perspective.
Yeah, and I think even, Elon Musk is not successful, right? So like this big splashy, I'm saying that sort of in quotations, right? Tongue in cheek.
Yeah.
But that idea of like, this can never fail because it's this person who's leading it.
Yeah.
This is sort of a broader anecdote, it's not specific, but every time I sit down and work with a company, and their feedback is, did you tell them what we want? Can you make our logo bigger? Can we make sure we put our message in there? That to me always leads to failure.
Mm.
Because we're starting out by making the stories about the thing we want folks to realize they're actually passionate about. Whereas if we just told a great story and aligned that brand with it, folks would get excited, they would get on board. But when we say, this brand is doing this, look at this, pay attention, because this is what we're doing with this story, we are doing it. When brands try to make themselves the stories rather than celebrate the stories that they have, that tends to lead to failure. And it's one that I see every single time we go out. And it takes them realizing that for savvy audiences where the entire world is at their fingertips, it's a failure to not tell them something new that doesn't get them excited. They can see through advertising, they can see through manufactured messages. But if you give them something exciting, something they haven't heard before, something they never expected, that untold story, that's when you can actually make them excited and not think about it as an ad, even though they're walking away and saying like, I remember that logo bug in the corner. I know who it was. And the average consumer needs 12 to 16 touch points to do anything.
Yeah.
Anything. And it's because of how much crap is out there.
Yeah.
So.
It all keeps growing.
I think just real quick jumping in, I think one of the things that I think about a lot is how does keeping forests make other people the heroes, right? How do we make our partners the heroes? How do we make the landowners the heroes? How do we make the corporations that are buying Southern the heroes? How do we position? We have a goal, right? Promote and expand markets for Southern forests that support private land ownership. I think we've niched it pretty well. But how do we make other people the hero in that story and not make it about Southern forests and how important we think they are? We have a lot of really cool untold stories, but how do we shift that messaging to something that really other people can grab onto? In my opinion, is when other people are telling your story and they think it's theirs, it's even better. What about you, Brooke? What's your market fail?
Well, this is one that I wrote about recently in my newsletter that I know that you saw. So a few years ago, I went to a conference, it was about social marketing, and the keynote speaker mentioned very briefly offhand that the Got Milk campaign wasn't successful. The keynote speaker, I gotta give him credit, Jack Jordan of the Rescue Agency. And he said, the Got Milk campaign wasn't successful. And I was like, what? Like, is this true? And so I decided to do my own research and write about it. And the Got Milk campaign was not technically successful. This is a campaign everybody knows and has had so many knockoff things. And I always get annoyed, like the first tagline somebody comes up with is like, got forests, right? And it's like, oh, can we please leave this? And it starts to get into some of these nuances of what does success mean. That campaign ran for a number of years, had so many celebrities in it, so well known. We still talk about it today. I think it may still be going on today. And won so many advertising awards. Like, this is an amazing creative campaign. Its goal was to get people to drink more milk. It did not successfully do that. It also came at a time where milk sales were declining and were probably going to continue to decline. So it's almost like a failed proposition of what its goal was in the first place. Like, bottled water started to replace milk, and they weren't going to turn the tide on that. Whereas things like dairy, other dairy products, yogurt, cheese, they're on the rise, and it takes a lot of milk to make those products. So, a pivot in their strategy could have done really well in terms of results, but amazingly, we see it as such a successful campaign, and yet it didn't produce results. And I think kind of separating that is an important part when we think about even the opposite, thinking about failure. What does failure actually mean? Maybe it hasn't worked yet, but we're making progress. Or, maybe it did it actually fail? And I just see this a lot in short-term campaigns that aren't yet producing the results and sometimes considered a failure. It's well, let's separate some of these things. Maybe the messaging's not working, maybe the goal is not right, maybe we have the wrong audience, and starting to dive into the details a little bit more so we don't just use kind of broad strokes on either success or failure.
Yeah, well, and I think your point around pivoting, could they have pivoted to?
Got cheese?
Yeah.
Cheese mustaches don't work, though. Oh, love the cheese mustache.
Well, the reason that,
Yogurt mustache would work, yeah.
the reason I was that I was asking for that, and it's interesting because we do have a question from the audience that speaks to this is, you know, more investment isn't necessarily better. And we're going back to a lot of our partner organizations, especially if they're in the nonprofits side of things, don't have the Coca-Cola budgets. And so, you know, a lot of these questions I've been tailoring to help our audience think about, like, it doesn't have to be everyone, it doesn't have to be all of the celebrities with got milk. I will say that, you know, we made a significant investment. I mean, Keeping Forest does not have a huge budget, but we decided to make a significant investment up front with Matchstick because we saw the long-term possibility of that. So that was a calculated risk that really has paid off for us and positioned us in a really good way. So, but there's a question that's coming from the audience that says, what does the upfront time investment look like for building a solid message and target audience? And then I would say both, she's not asking this, she's more asking about time, but I would say time and financial, what's the best way that you make a case for that with your stakeholders, or perhaps even the people who are saying yes or no to that investment in budget? So what can people expect for time to change essentially, and then how do you make a case for that?
For us, the research side is usually the big kicker on time. You know, we do a lot of qualitative and quantitative research in many cases, or just stakeholder management / alignment. You know, we're trying to get input from a lot of different coalition members or different stakeholders. That usually is the big kicker. But assuming that that's not in play, you know, for us on the messaging side, usually it's a series of collaborative sessions with clients that takes, I don't know, 4 to 6 weeks to really understand who they are, what they're trying to do based on the research, and then how to set the right tone and the right voice together to define certain phrases or certain attributes that are associated with that. So the brand messaging that we do on the voice level is a little bit more theory. We tease it out and show practically what this sounds like and looks like, but it's also usually higher level voice so that internal teams can take that voice and apply it to endless amount of channels and touch points across. So anywhere from 4 to 6 weeks, typically, with the big caveat of research.
Yeah. Well,
makes it a lot longer.
Also with us, the way that it engaged partners was so different. Like, people were so excited about that. So time kind of went away for people because our partners were so engaged and interested and got to choose the logo. They got to tell the story that helped you tell a story. So time kind of disappeared when we were talking about branding. It's a different case when we're talking about the long-term impact of, you know, story and messaging. So how do we make a case for that financially and time investment wise?
First of all, I love that question, because the second worst failure that, you know, going back to our last question, is we want to be on all the channels. And that goes back to the audience and everyone questioning. We have very limited time and very limited resources often. And rather than apply blunt force pressure to 5 areas, the best advice I can give on how to value your own time and how to value that investment of time is to choose the one area that's going to have the best opportunity to reach that audience. And with storytelling, that's a day-to-day thing. There's not a single day you can take your foot off that gas pedal. And if you're trying to do that on Facebook and your blog, on Instagram, and your intern last summer said TikTok's great, so you're trying to do that now. All of that is one of the biggest pitfalls that I see folks making when they're asking that question. That they're concerned about how much time and investment, but then they still want to hit every platform. And I think the best way to cut through, reduce your time, reduce your investment, is to not only own your stories, yourself, not give them to a platform. But make sure that you're limiting, that time and cost that comes along with storytelling, because it has to be every day and you have to be passionate about it and excited about it. But that can't be everywhere and to everyone.
Can I modify the question just for you a little bit?
Sure, yeah.
Because you have a course, a training course that you run for communicators and others, right? And I have noticed on your website that you have here's how to get your boss to pay for this. Right? And so, which I think is really cool, because you've actually answered the question, like, here's why it's worth my time and my money. So yeah, I mean, maybe from that lens and thinking about how to advance the skills of people within organizations, what are your thoughts on making the case?
Yeah.
Essentially.
I wish it was mandatory, I believe in it so much, and what I believe in is just learning some of these skills, these practical skills that we can use to effectively communicate or communicate more effectively. And everyone needs that in their job, and I think the field of conservation has sort of siloed that skill to maybe the social marketing team or the, donor engagement marketing team. They're the ones that get the skills of communication and engagement. But everyone throughout those organizations are interfacing and engaging with some audience that they work with. And sometimes these are like the beneficiaries. So like it's actually truly the audience. And they don't have backgrounds in communication or messaging or, audience engagement. Our biologists, scientists, they know the topic so well and sort of struggle with this dynamic of how do I take what I know and even what I love and I'm passionate about and share it with this other person, without falling into that pitfall of like, it's about me and what I believe in and what I want you to know, as opposed to what's going to engage the person. So I think in that way, it's an investment that's critical across the board in conservation and sustainability. Everyone should know how to just take that pause and say, okay, I know this is what I want to say. Because I think it's hard to make it an instinct if you're not built with it. And so I don't want anyone to think like they have to make it their instinct. What I want everyone to build into them is that pause of like, this is what I want to say. How do I actually say it? And kind of go through some of this kind of, a la carte menu they have of like, I could say it this way, I could say it that way. All right, I'm going to go with part B and make it sound exciting or cool or sexy or relevant or all of those different things they could use. Because I just think it's so essential for folks who are working in an area where they care passionately about what they do. They know it so well and just struggle to share that with other people. And I think that comes back to storytelling. Even if it's not technically their story, it's like, how do I bring this? I think you said this earlier, bring this person in. And I think that's a skill that we need at every level of every organization. And something I can teach sort of the template and the tools to make it feel less daunting and not like I have to get a, major in communications or go work at an ad agency. Like there's some things we can start doing today that whether it's internal communication or external communication, it's just going to make it more powerful and more effective in the end.
Yeah, I think about the messages that you have given Keeping Forest, that Matchstick has helped Keeping Forest to identify, that we kind of say over and over again, the messaging playbook that's available to everyone on our website, which will be more clearly available in the next month when we launch our new website. It's like, okay, we designed that to be able to technically market, but it's almost like what you're saying is anybody could take that messaging playbook and just make it their daily job to say one of these messages every day, and it doesn't and like they don't have to invent it.
Right. Yeah.
And that goes to something I read that you said. We'll probably take some questions after this. We have just about 6 minutes. I loved this. You said, do not sacrifice clarity at the altar of distinction. Tell me what that means.
Well, when we work with ambitious organizations, sometimes there's a big figurehead that's like, we're going to be everything to everyone, or that they say something like, well, we're kind of like Netflix, but then we're also like, the ACLU. And you're like, I don't even understand what that means, but it's different. Wow, that sure feels different. So of the radically relevant model, there's 6 kind of main factors. Clarity is the first one for a reason. Because if people don't understand the basics of what it is that you do, how are they ever going to engage with you, you know? So sometimes clarity is sacrificed because leaders want to be so distinct and so different, which I get, and I love that, but the clarity piece it's an ante, it has to be there. So sometimes people strive for unique language. I actually see this a lot when you're trying to define your brand. The first thing is like, what's our noun? What are we? Are we a coalition? Are we a nonprofit? Are we a cause in the world? Like, what's the thing, you know, the noun that we go to? And that's a lot of times where you see ambitious leaders strive for like a new noun, or like, we're not like anything else that exists that's out there. And you have to just choose your battle, because you're either going to be coming up with a brand new category term and a new thing that then you have to explain, or you just find a point of reference that people understand, but then you add the caveat, yeah, but we're like this that you're familiar with, but actually it's this isn't this. So clarity is the most important when you start thinking about brand communications, and the distinction has to be there, but not at the sake of being unclear.
I think we sometimes in the conservation community, think that we're so distinct, but don't actually clarify the why.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, and also going back to some of what we've learned with some of our audiences, it has to be as simple as like cutting trees is not bad.
Yeah.
We have a sign over here that, you can't see, but that y'all helped us to build out. It's carpentry that is happening, and the message is to save a forest, use it, like that simple, which also draws in, okay, what is that? What does that mean?
Yeah.
It brings in a curious question aspect.
Yeah.
So just with a few minutes left, I think we have one more question. Do you make it a point to center joy and solutions in the content in the content you create? How well does it resonate with your audience? Do you make it a point to center joy and solutions in the content you create?
I think the question is, I'm curious to get y'all's take on this, is how much do you sort of inflame the problem with communications versus showing the hopefulness or the joy of it? I worked with Atlanta at the time, their Atlanta Union Mission years ago to help them rebrand to Atlanta Mission. And I was like, it's all about hope. It's all about those facing homelessness to have hope, right? It's all about hope. And their direct mail people were like, yeah, no one gives money to hope though. Like, we have to have someone that looks like they're without a home on the cover of our direct mail envelope. And I'm like, no, the brand's all about hope. So, I think the heart of the question is like, how much of the story do you show off the solution or the problem?
I really lean into the joy and solution side, but that is where a little bit of like the goal to raise money versus the goal to get people engaged and taking action sometimes need some different treatments. And I've heard that from, the donor groups all the time, is like fear, sadness brings in the money. And maybe that's true, but I also think we should be testing that among younger generations that have increasingly more disposable income. And if that works for them, or if it's a generational thing, I focus on joy and solutions because there's just so much like climate anxiety out there now, climate grief, there's fear. I think many of us feel like if I could just crawl under my bed, for the next decade, I'd like to do that. That doesn't get people taking action and doing things. Like the sense that my actions might actually add up and make a difference, might actually lead to some change, is what moves people. And for me, that certainly is solution oriented. And sometimes when appropriate, it is also inclusive of joy, because that's something that, consumers are seeking a lot now in many ways to escape from that grief and anxiety, is like, can I be part of something that makes me a little happy, that brings some levity, that brings some humor? It's not going to be appropriate for all brands and all organizations or even all messages, but when it's there, I think it's great to use some fun and joy.
I think that's something that ebbs and flows, and right now, my friend and I use this term a lot to describe a sort of growing audience in America. Doomer optimists. Folks that are like, this is all wrong. but I think we can figure it out. And
Me too.
yeah,
We need to figure it
need
out,
to.
yeah.
And I think right now, there's so much messaging going on that's telling me I can't like you,
Mhm.
and that I can't like you, and that I'm on a different page than you. And so right now I find myself not necessarily leaning into joy, but leaning into love.
Mm.
Because that's what's missing from how we talk to each other right now. In this race to distinguish from one another so often, it means drawing a line and saying that there's a difference between you and I. And I think you mentioned younger audiences. There's this real like swelling of younger people. They don't see red and blue. They don't see black and white. They're like, I want a solution.
Mhm.
I'll work with you. I don't care where you're from. But that maybe they don't articulate this. I love you is what they're saying.
Mm.
I love you and you're worth me taking action on. And that's such a powerful thing, and we're not getting fed it.
True.
The one nice area for me is I don't have to distill that conversation into a piece of collateral. I get to do it over a 11-minute video.
Yeah.
So, and I need the problem, because if I don't have a problem, I can't create the arc change of what hope looks like.
Yeah,
If we were just telling a story on veterans with PTSD and only focusing on the problem, that's story's heavy, and it doesn't give us anything to walk away from. Now, if we tell the story of veterans with PTSD that are going into recreational hunting of alligators to be in nature.
Which we're gonna do that.
I'm just making sure we got our videos lined up, Laura. But right there, we've created that arc change.
Yeah.
That, yeah, there is a problem. And there's people out there that dare to fight for that solution.
I thank you so much for this conversation. I feel like it could go on all day, and I have the fortune of being around you for a few more hours anyway. You know, as I think about what you just said, Puya, you have an 11-minute arc, right? And Blake, you and Matchstick offer a different lens of how to communicate, and you, Brooke, offer a different lens of how to communicate. It really is the blend of all three of those, and
Mhm.
Keeping Forest could not do it without you. We would not be where we are without you. And I hope for you participants today that you can take away some nuggets about how to apply some of this work. I want to also say, with regard to time, this has taken us a really long time to get here. I mean, we're starting with 2019 and working on the branding piece, but that also took from 2016 to 2019, working with our partners to define the strategy so that we could actually go to Matchstick and say, okay, help us with this, or, you know, a few years later, go to Brooke, say, help us with this, and now with Puya. So I want to encourage you to take it one step at a time, not try to, as the metaphor goes, eat the whole elephant at one time, and really think about what you can do today, because I think that there are core messages that each of you have, and to be able to find that, and just even you communicating that over and over and over again is going to help clarify, and I think bring clarity to others. So in my work with leaders, apart from Keeping Forest, when I talk about creativity, first of all, we are all creative, and to me, creativity is creating the impacts that matter most. So hopefully you've gathered some good insight today that will help you go out and create those impacts. We will send out this webinar via recording. I do ask you, there's a 3-question exit survey. Please take that so that we have a sense of what's working and what's not. And we will see you in August for another webinar. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thank you, Laura.